Welcome to Penn State Dickinson Law's Profiles in Leadership series. My name is Daryl Lim. I serve as the H. Letty Montag Chair and Associate Dean for Research and Innovation at the Law School. This series offers an unparalleled opportunity to glean insights from top leaders who serve in government, education, and the private sector, and civil society. In each episode, we invite these leaders to reflect on their journey and share skills, core values, and qualities that make them the leaders they are today. We're very pleased today to have Suzanne Harrison, co-founder and principal at Percipience LLC, a board-level advisory firm focused on IP strategy and management, quantifying and mitigating IP risk, increasing IP value capture, and focused innovation. Suzanne is also the founder of Gathering 2.0, the first online peer community for IP professionals, and a convener of the ICM Gathering group of 25 companies who have been leading since 1995 to define, create, and benchmark best practices around IP management and other intangibles. Suzanne has written numerous articles and is a frequent speaker about how companies can extract value from their innovations. She is the co-author of Einstein in the Boardroom and Edison in the Boardroom. And we'll be talking more about those two books later on in our podcast. So first of all, welcome, Suzanne.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Tell us what's top of your mind right now.
Oh, so a few things. I really have sort of three topics that are becoming intertwined. The first is the relationship of intellectual property to national security and national competitiveness, and how that is being utilized and how we should think of those tools in that new paradigm. The second is around inclusive innovation. How do we get more people to innovate in our nation? That helps us with economic and technological competitiveness and, not surprisingly, national security. And the third is how to keep intellectual property relevant for today. I mean, we have a declining IP profession. We have a dissatisfaction with the IP ecosystem and the IP process. And we have a question about whether or not the USPTO and intellectual property, in particular patents, are still relevant in today's competitive environment. And so those are the things that I've been sort of thinking about and working on.
Great. And one thing I didn't mention in my introduction of you, but I'd love to hear more about, is your role in the PPAC. So tell us about the PPAC and tell us about the report as chair that you recently worked on.
Sure. Well, PPAC is an advisory board for the Patent Office that focuses on patents. And our role is to work with both bringing the public perceptions and information into the Patent Office and also providing our advice to the director as she requests it. We also work with individual staff members. And again, we bring in outside perspectives and speakers to the USPTO to try and inform their decisions. So for the last, this is my second year, I'm entering my third year of PPAC. That's a 3-year term. Last year I was chair, and our focus last year was, not surprisingly, on IP and national security, inclusive innovation, and also trying to help the USPTO use patent data to better inform their decision-making and the decision-making of other government agencies.
So how do you come up with these themes: national security, economic competitiveness, diversity, equity, inclusion? Does the director tell you these are the things that we want you to focus on? Does the PPAC come up with them?
Yes, the PPAC comes up with them themselves. Obviously, the director has his or her own focus of things they want to work on. And in fact, inclusive innovation has been one since Director Iancu was there that Kathy Vidal continued and expanded upon. So that was a natural one, that was a fit. The national security and using data to inform decisions is actually one really more that the PPAC chose to focus on.
And once you choose to focus on something, how much liberty are you given in terms of the information that you're collecting, the information that gets communicated?
So I think that overall, PPAC has a lot of flexibility in what it chooses to work on. I think as with all things, when you're in an advisory board position, and particularly one for a government, it's really akin to, hi, I'm here from corporate, I'm here to help you, right? Nobody really likes people looking over their shoulder. So I think part of the job of PPAC is to be both helpful and useful in a nice way, right? To the extent you can. There's nothing that says the PTO has to provide us data or insights, but I found that overall, most of the people are very receptive and interested. But again, there are limitations to what they can and will share with us. So we do our best to work around that. And we've been successful in so far, but I do think that it's a bit of a dance.
And then what happens after that? Just looking at past PPAC reports, do they get implemented by the USPTO? Does it form some kind of where does the rubber meet the road?
I wish. Unfortunately, PPAC has zero power. We can only provide our advice. We can't do anything to ensure that they implement it. But I think again, part of the role of PPAC is to surface these issues outside the PTO. And hopefully, if there are things that the public and or Congress is interested in, they can also pick them up and begin asking questions about them. And
has that
PTO does implement some of those things. So again, it's a bit of a mix.
Okay. Well, it's good to know, because one thing that people say about the USPTO is nothing ever changes at the USPTO, right?
Well, I think that's all about government, right? I mean, part of it's like trying to turn a battleship. Nothing ever happens quickly. But
Yeah.
I will say that change is happening at the PTO. And I think that all of PPAC is actually very proud of both our parts in that, but also watching the change happen.
Great. So you were quoting, I think, somebody, perhaps just the received conventional wisdom, where you posted on LinkedIn saying people have lamented to you that nothing ever changes at the USPTO. Has your perception changed now, having served on the PPAC?
Well, as I said before, the key is it changes slowly. And so sometimes it's hard to see, right? It's like watching an iceberg move, right? It never seems to happen. And then you actually measure it and it's moved quite a bit. So I will say that the USPTO has become more interested in the relationship between patents and GDP. And jobs. And also the relationship between patents and national security. And so those are new ideas and new concepts for them. So they are busy, I think, trying to understand what those impacts look like and what their role in that is. I don't think there's a definitive answer for that yet, but I foresee it to be happening soon. More importantly, I think Congress is seeing that, right? And that actually is probably more important than what the USPTO sees, because if Congress wants to ensure that those things happen, they can task the USPTO to do them.
And how much continuity do you expect, given that elections are happening next year and the leadership of the PTO may look quite different in 2025, regardless?
Yeah, so I will say that, that the director of the PTO is a political appointment. And so realistically, not much really changes from the director perspective. If you look at David Kapos, Andre Iancu, and Kathy Vidal, there have been changes at the edges, but I think directionally, the USPTO is going in the same way. It's where they want to place their emphasis on, and each director has a particular, I say, pet project or interest that they're focused on. But overall, the PTO direction stays the same from what I can see.
Thanks. So let's talk a little bit about your background. You have a really fascinating background. And one of the things that you mentioned in your LinkedIn post from a couple of years ago is your background in strategy, finance, and organizational behavior. And you talked about data and how that can help some of the things that we just talked about: national economic, technological competitiveness, inclusivity, innovation. What in particular have you seen in terms of those skill sets, strategy, finance, and organizational behavior, come into play during your time on the PPAC?
Well, I think it's all about that, right? So I would say that, first off, let's talk about finance. If you don't understand how an organization makes money, then you don't understand how you can or cannot change the organization, right? So as we all know, the patent office makes money by granting patents, by examining and granting patents and other intellectual property. For the moment, since I'm PPAC, I'll just say focus on patents. They do not charge full freight for that service. They make their money up, they discount the front end of it, and they make their money up on maintenance and renewals. So they are dependent upon companies and patent owners continuing to maintain their patents. So if, for example, tech companies decided against maintaining their patents or holding them for as long, that would severely impact the finances of the patent office, right? So you have to understand the behavior of your customers. In this case, they're one of customers or stakeholders. And I think you also have to figure out how to price your product. But here's the problem. The USPTO doesn't control the pricing of their product. Congress does. So it's a very bizarre system, to be honest. And it's hard to, the USPTO isn't allowed to use fees to change user behavior, which again leads to some dysfunctionality in what patent owners do and how they manage their portfolios, which again leaves the USPTO with some odd incentives. So that's the first thing. Finances, know how you make money and know what you can and can't do. Organizational behavior, right? So when we talked about changing a government agency, people generally don't like change. That's true for everyone. So if you're going to change an organization, you have to understand how you can do it in ways that fit with the culture and how you can reorganize around a set of priorities that people agree to, right? So as a leader, you need to understand what your strategy is, and you need people to buy into that and into the new organization. So I think that you've seen a shift, say, from 10 or 15 years ago, where the patent office was really about, granting widgets. Our job is to grant widgets. How do we make that factory better? How do we improve it? How do we make it more efficient? Now you're seeing more of an outward focus. I mean, they're still focusing on the factory, but you're seeing more of an outward focus to understand, how do we bring more people into the system? How do we improve the system? How do we make it more equitable and available for all people to come and invent? So again, those are changes, and it will change 10 or 15 years from now, probably will look slightly different as well. It's trying to anticipate what those moves are going to be and understand how you're going to organize to achieve those goals.
Thanks. Now, I'm going to ask you about your background a little bit more, taking you all the way back to 1983. But before that, I also want to flag for our Penn State Dickinson Law community that Suzanne Harrison is a member of our IP and Innovation Initiatives Advisory Board, and we're very proud to have her on our board. So thank you for your service.
Thank you.
So 1983, you're thinking of doing something, you decide to do economics. Help us to join the dots. How did you get from economics to IP all the way to the PPAC?
Yeah, so I have to go back a little farther. So when I was in high school, my father took a job with a company called SRI International, where he was, my father was an engineer, where he actually began to do management consulting in the technology arena. And what that looked like was, for someone like Canon, they would hire SRI to come in and tell them, what would the camera of the future look like 20 years from now? What are the features that people are going to want, and what technologies needed to be created to do that? When, as you with all high school kids, you're really busy, you're not paying attention. My dad was traveling all the time. And so when he was home, in order to try and connect with him, I just started asking him what he was doing, right? What is your new job? What do you do? And it just sounded really interesting. And so I was like, okay, that sounds good. I want to do that. I didn't even know intellectual property was involved in that at the time. And so when I looked around, it seemed like the best way to get a management consulting position was to do an economics degree. They didn't have business at that time. And so that's how I started in economics. And I went through university, knew I wanted to be in consulting, something technology, but I will say I'm not an engineer. I'm not a scientist. I understand those things, but that wasn't what I was interested in. And so when I got out, I found, to my horror, that I went to UC Davis, and UC Davis was not a good enough school at that time to be hired for anything other than secretaries to management consulting firms like Booz Allen or BCG. And I was very angry. I was like, wait a minute, I don't want a job as a secretary. I want to be a consultant. And they were like, oh, no, I'm sorry. You didn't go to a good enough school. And so I just started trying to get informational interviews and meet people. And through a friend of a friend, was recommended into a firm. It was called the Mac Group. And they had a new division where they were doing, it was management consulting with slightly more math, which we now know as litigation consulting. That company is now called Cornerstone. So I managed to get my consulting job, and I was the only I guess, top tier school person when I joined. So, which was interesting. And I learned all about intellectual property because there were patent cases. There were also insider trading cases, and it was calculating damages for all of these instances. And I found I really just liked the inventors because I liked being closer to the technology. So ended up doing that, ended up doing more general management consulting, really like strategy, organizational design, all of those things. And then frankly, went out on my own and just started doing more work around those strategy things. And at the time, I worked with my father. We went and started our own company. And one of the first things we did was a strategic visioning project for NASA. With Sally Ride, trying to understand where NASA wanted to be in 20 years. And that strategic visioning project came up with 3 very different views that NASA could do in its quest in the 20 years. And they ended up choosing one. And it was just really fascinating. And that helped me understand that technology and strategy were really, really interesting.
How was it like working with your father?
It was yes, with all things, it's great and not great.
Who was the boss?
Right. Well, I was probably the boss, right? No. So I think it was very helpful because you have high level trust. I think it was very difficult because when we would go places to conferences, people would assume I was his mistress or some other random wife, or that was very awkward. But I worked with my dad for quite a long time. And at one point, my brother even joined us. And we did that through, I think, 2005, right? So from 88 to 2005. And then I think after all of that, we decided all of us wanted a break and to go do something else. So we all split.
No hard feelings.
No hard feelings. We all split up and kind of went our separate ways.
Ever thought of getting back together?
My brother now isn't interested in management consulting at all, and my dad is retired. So, I mean, I did have my dad come and work with me on the Einstein book and the second Edison book. So, obviously that still happened, but yeah, no. I think we're good where we are.
Okay, anyway, I interrupted you. Please continue.
Yeah, so I think that in the course of working with my father, we began to meet heads of R&D who had been tasked by their CEOs to try and help figure out how to move their stock price because they were trading at or near their asset value. And what was interesting is we had chemical companies, we had tech companies, we had pharma companies, we had defense companies. They were all sort of random industries and, insurance. But we managed to get everyone together in a room and started trying to figure out how to do this. That was what led to the gathering, the ICM Gathering. And it turned out that the key to all of that was the management of intangibles, and in particular, intellectual property. And so we worked to create some frameworks, some definitions, ultimately we had best practices and things that companies could do. That group, which began in 1995, still exists today. It's still around 20 companies, and we tend to work today on looking out 3 to 5 years to understand what problems are coming down the pipe and how can we start thinking about them, messaging them to management, and if we're lucky enough, even solving them.
Are you still actively involved in that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I lead that, and that's the best practices group. And I think now, and a lot of these concepts that I'm working on are usually previewed in that group because we've identified them as issues and we want to understand how to start thinking about them or even potentially solving them.
Now, how do you decide who gets to be in the group?
So it's a very democratic process, right? Everyone in the group gets to vote on anyone who wants to come in. And so we care less about company names. We care more about the individual, and they have to be intellectually curious and interesting and bring a perspective and be willing to ask questions.
So these are in-house counsel, or who are these people?
They're all in-house counsel. We have, well, back in 95, it was almost all heads of R&D. Now it's a combination of in-house counsel and heads of licensing.
And how do you decide on how big the group should be?
We always try to keep it around 20 companies. Again, you want it to be a very trusted environment, and we find that having more companies, people don't get to know each other as well. And so, again, we just try to keep it around that number.
Is it like,
go
go ahead.
I was going to say it's anywhere between 15 and 20, depending on who we find to be in the group.
And what happens when there are new companies that are doing interesting things with people who are willing to ask interesting questions?
What do you mean? What happens when?
Well, let's say Tesla didn't exist in 1995. So if somebody from Tesla wanted to join and you've got 25 or 30 people, what do you say to Tesla?
So a couple of things, right? So we find that it doesn't matter what I think. I tend to interview the people just to try and understand what they're doing and see if they're doing something interesting or different. If the answer is yes, I present them to the group. Anyone in the group has the ability to say no for competitive reasons. That's happened very, very rarely. But potentially that could happen. If not, then we invite them to a meeting. People get to interact with them. If they like them, we can invite them to join. And if it just turns out that it's not everyone's cup of tea or vice versa, we let it be and they go on their merry way.
Is it mostly tech, manufacturing, biopharma?
Tech. Yeah, it is largely tech. We have a combination. Well, I'd say it's predominantly tech today. When we first started, it was predominantly chemicals and pharma. So over the years, it's been a complete switch. Right now, I think it's largely tech. We do have some pharma and chemicals in there right now, but because most of the ambiguity in the law is around tech. And so they're trying to understand, or collectively, we all are trying to understand what that ambiguity looks like and how do companies operate in that ambiguity.
Is it then essentially a think tank? Do you do advocacy work? What's the KPI of what's been done in a year, whether it meets the goals?
So there is no KPI for the group. The group.
I'm shocked, Suzanne. In a group you are involved in, no KPIs.
Well, the KPI is they can walk away if they don't like it, right? So honestly, it's really about raising issues and trying to find solutions. So I think for each year, we tend to have 2 or 3 themes that we're working on. And then as new and interesting things pop up, we can bring in outside speakers to cover that or as things come up. I will say the average life of a company in the gathering is about 10 years. DuPont was in for 25. I think AT&T's been in for over 20, almost 25 years now. People tend to stay in the group when they change companies. The most we've had is 7 changes of a company. So again, I would say you tell me what the KPI is. People seem to like it. They tend to write it into their next job because they find it to be interesting and helpful. So
interesting. And how did you come up with this?
Honestly, it was because it all started because we were curious how to answer this question of how to move stock price. And we found that getting a bunch of interesting people together and trying to solve this unique problem, everyone brought a different perspective. And then we would have the companies go and try it out, whatever we were trying to solve. Could you do X back at your company and come back with the answer? And so everybody found it so powerful and so helpful. They just kept asking to do it more and more and more. So we've been doing that all along the way. I mean, I will say I've tried to shut the group down 2 or 3 times and been wildly unsuccessful because they don't want me to. So
why would you want to shut it down?
Well, I'm not sure if this is the only thing I want to do with my life. And then two, a couple of instances, one during 2008, I wasn't convinced that people were going to still want to pay in the middle of a massive economic downturn, and the companies proved me wrong. In another instance, again, just not sure whether it was still being relevant. Like I didn't feel that we were making progress. And so I told the companies that I wasn't interested in doing this if we weren't going to do interesting things. And so
but there are no KPIs.
Again, you have to go with the people in the group, what they're interested in, right? So I just didn't feel that they were working towards interesting goals. And so then they decided they wanted to do something different.
So if you stepped out today, are we talking about ICM or are we talking about Gathering 2.0? Are they pretty much the same thing?
No, they're different, right? So what happened was we had this gathering and it met in person. Then about 2006, 2007, companies were interested in learning how to transact and sell naked patents, because at that time, Intellectual Ventures was doing a very good job of transacting patents very quickly. And companies felt at a disadvantage because they didn't know how they could do that. So some subset of the gathering came and we started a second group called Gathering 2.0. That group was going to basically standardize the patent transaction process, the valuation, dealing with encumbrances. How do you do that very quickly and efficiently so they could compete more effectively against IV? Then we were also going to create an online transaction platform and use the data that was generated from that platform to then create a model that would allow us to value patents across their lifetime, so that people, and particularly financial people, would understand the value of those assets and be able to use that. So think of like a FICO score for your credit worthiness. We were going to do that for patents, except to determine their value.
Cool. So question then, if you stepped out of Gathering 2.0 today,
yes,
would it still continue?
It's not continuing now, right? So what happened was we had 17 companies together. I raised $1 million. I went out for financing, which as a woman is quite difficult. And by the time I secured a term sheet with NEA, the crash came in 2008. So they weren't allowed, they just said, hey, we can't take on any new investments. And so the opportunity passed.
Is it time for 3.0?
Yeah, maybe. Who knows?
Yeah. So talk about that. You made a very interesting comment as women looking for financing. Why was that particularly different?
Well, first off, there aren't very many women founder, more now, but certainly back in the day, there were not. I was very fortunate because a woman founder, a previous woman investor, Ruth Ann Quinlan, connected with me and decided to mentor me and help me. Even having her sort of handpick who I could go to for VCs, I still would go pitch people and have them tell me, we love everything about it. My management will not fund a woman. And so, that's a pretty visceral reaction, right? I will also say that in many instances, and a few of the companies even that were behind this initiative were very unhappy to have a woman founder and didn't like that at all. So again, it's just this discrimination and bias exists, and pretending that it doesn't really is difficult, right?
Have we moved beyond that today, you think?
No, it's still massively difficult if you're a woman to get funded. If you're a woman and Black or brown, it's even worse. If you are even male of Black or brown, and it is difficult. It very difficult, which makes some of the lawsuits that are going on with Edward Blum suing law firms and corporations for their diversity initiatives even more egregious, right? So again, it just shows the bias that exists.
Do you see a way out of this? Is it through lawsuits or something else?
I don't think it's through lawsuits. I do think that corporations and law firms can make a massive difference. I think you just keep trying to, again, let's be honest, right? There is there is racism that exists today in our current hiring and practices, where we don't say whether we want to choose a white person or a non-white person, and yet predominantly who's hired? White people, right? So, well, guess what? What if we did it the other way? What if we never stated a preference, but we only hired Black or brown people? Like, corporations can fix this problem. They just have to focus on it.
Mm.
But the
So,
real problem is that people are biased. People are biased. So, pretending as if there's not unconscious bias is ridiculous, right? And this is where patent data comes into play. In the inventorship process, we can see, using patent data, where biases are embedded in decision processes in the inventorship process. And so a lot of the work that I'm doing on inclusive inventorship is really using that data to spot where there's patterns that make no sense, delve into the decision making, and uncover the bias and eradicate it.
do you feel like you're getting more traction with DEI when you link it to economic competitiveness and national security?
100%.
And people are listening.
Yes. Corporations have been listening all along, because they don't care that it's connected to GDP. It's connected to their bottom line. They're doing it because it makes inventors happy. It potentially connects them better to their customer base. It also allows them to get new ideas and new products that they wouldn't have had, because people with different perspectives have different relationships to products and see ideas and necessary in ways that maybe others hadn't, right? So let's talk about Facebook, right? Facebook Marketplace was invented because Deborah Liu, who was a new mom at the time, needed to find a way for her mom's groups to deal with, how do you get rid of old baby stuff, right? And her boss, who was male at the time, said, no one's ever going to want to do that. And then now it's $1 billion. It makes $1 billion a year, right? Different perspective. And she said, yes, I think this is important. This is going to take off. We can talk about Spanx, right? Male patent attorneys never saw why this was a good idea until one individual, his teenage daughter, looked over his shoulder and said, oh my God, that's amazing. What is this? You have to do this. And the guy was like, this isn't important. And the daughter was like, oh, you have no idea. You need to help this woman. And boom, she got a patent on it. Up until then, nobody seemed interested. They didn't see it as a differentiable product. So
Sounds like there's still hope.
Yeah, there's still hope, right?
Yeah.
So,
and to talk about Mothers Group, tell us about the Golden Gate Mothers Group.
I don't know anything about the Golden Gate Mothers Group. No.
Maybe fake news. 2002, 2004. Your LinkedIn page says you were involved in the Golden Gate Mothers Group.
I don't remember that. That's so long ago.
Okay.
I hope we're going to get that out.
Now, one of the people that runs through at least three things that we want to talk about, I think the Gathering, USIPA, and your two books is Scott Frank.
Yep.
How did that connection come about? And talk about your role in each of those three with Scott.
Yeah, so I met Scott back in the late 90s. AT&T was very interested in joining the Gathering. And at that time, we had in the group Sprint. And Sprint called out that they didn't want AT&T because they felt it was a competitive difficulty. So I had to turn Scott down, and Scott was not happy. The minute Sprint left the group, Scott came in and has never left. So he found, I think, this focus on understanding how to use IP for value to be very relevant for his role as CEO in AT&T's holding company. So throughout all of that, when Scott went to create USIPA, the Gathering had already been working on increasing diversity and inventorship for the previous year or two. Within the group, we were trying to figure out how to get data, how could we benchmark against the USPTO numbers, and we realized how difficult it was. I mean, we were naive enough that we thought we'd be able to do it easily and be able to show people how to do it. It didn't work that way. And so Scott came to me and said, I'm starting this organization, the USIP Alliance, and I'd like you to be running the DEI portion of that or D&I portion of that with Alan Lowe. And I said, sure, I'd be happy to, right? I mean, it's a continuation of what we're doing here that we can't seem to achieve. And Alan and I took the work that, by the way, Alan's in the gathering. Alan and I took the work that we had been doing in the group and expanded upon it and created the diversity pledge to have companies pick an underrepresented group. Shocker, everyone picked women. We have because we can get the data, and began to a 3-year process of benchmarking their progress amongst a set of best practices, right? So we're into our 3rd year. We're about to release our first data report. And what we can see is that when companies focus on an underrepresented inventor group, they can change the amount of patent applications through this process, through mentoring, through watching their wording, through looking at their decision-making, taking out bias. And it's actually helped all inventorship. So male inventorship goes up as well as female inventorship, which is, I think, an important thing to note.
So here's a chance to make a pitch, because we may have people from universities, companies listening to this. How can they be part of this diversity pledge?
Go to USIPA and you just sign the pledge. There's no money required. All you have to do is agree to anonymously share data on our data surveys, which happen once a year, and we immediately put you into a working group so you can work with other companies and organizations to share information about best practices, what works, but more importantly, what doesn't. I will say that we're now working with the National Academy of Inventors to start this for academic institutions, because what they do is slightly different than what companies do. So again, trying to put like with like and help speed up the process.
Thanks. So you've worked with a lot of people over the years. Who has been the most impressive person that you've worked with?
Oh, wow. I think, over time, I will say it's been different people at different times, right? So when we first started, Sharon Oriole of Dow Chemical was amazing. She really understood how to think about and manage intellectual property in ways that created an immense amount of value for Dow. Jeff Weedman from Procter & Gamble, when they started trying to think through open innovation and how that looked and what that would look like, he was another game changer, I think, for the industry. We had folks from Eli Lilly Ventures who made an immense amount of difference in how people think about investing and the use of technology in that initiative. Gene Suchodolski from Boeing and Microsoft, who really thought through how do you know that everything in your portfolio is good, and she began to sample that to understand how to ensure quality throughout your entire portfolio. Again, I can go on and on and on. We had folks from Europe. We had the Danish Patent Office. The head of the Danish Patent Office was in for 10 years. We had the Canadian Institute of Chartered Accountants came in for about 10 years, where we probably, I think at that time, we knew the most about how to think about IP and accounting and what was really required and necessary until the US accounting organizations decided they didn't want to do it and tried to quash the whole thing. So I think it's really been fascinating over the years to see the ebb and flow of what have been the problems. There have been a number of problems that we still have that nobody has solved yet, right? How do you metric KPIs for a portfolio that are more meaningful than just numbers and quantity? How do you determine what is the right amount to have in your portfolio of things? How do you still align yourself, your portfolio value, with what the business wants? I mean, I would say that what's shocking to me as a business person is how little business acumen IP attorneys have and or want to have. So, again, they aren't teaching business in law school. You aren't necessarily learning business in a law firm. It's not until you get to the company that you begin to learn about strategy, management, how these things fit into the organization in ways that you need to participate, and how you counsel executives to make decisions about that utilize this portfolio in ways that matter to them, right? So yeah, it's sort of the last bastion within a company that really has not had a lot of management discipline.
Personal heroes, apart from IP management, do you have any?
I don't know. I need to think about that one a little bit more. Nothing comes in mind quickly, but I mean, obviously I have heroes, but I have to think about that. Sorry.
Well, that's fine. Uh, I've always admired your honesty. Let's talk about failures then. So part of being a leader is learning from failures. What's that journey been like for you in learning from failure?
Huge, right? So I would say Gathering 2 was a failure. I mean, here I took people's money, I put it all together. My goal was to get it funded, and I didn't, right? And in the middle of a downturn, I had to shut the whole thing down. That's a failure. But that was probably a massive turning point in my life for me. So I was so afraid, and this is a typical woman thing, I think. You're so afraid of not being seen as credible, as relevant, as, there's sort of imposter syndrome, right? And at the end of that, I was like, you know what? I survived. I'm in the middle of a downturn. I don't have a job. It was in the middle of remodeling. My husband and I were remodeling our house. And I remember after the whole thing imploded, I came home and I literally could see from the front of the house through the back of the house because it was all taken apart. And I thought, wow, this is a bad day, right? And so what do? You get back, I called up everybody and said, okay, I need a consulting project. I need to do some stuff. And bless our hearts, people started giving me work, and I'm like, okay, I'm not dead. It's all fine. So once you learn that failure is not the end, then you realize it doesn't matter. I can always get a job. I can fail and I can recover. So now I'm invincible. Now I'm fearless. Now I do all the things that scare me because I know the worst case thing has already happened and I'm fine.
So percipience, did that come out of that type of thinking? I want to do my own thing, and it's okay because I can fail.
Absolutely. So it turned out that Percipience came about with Ron Laurie and Jim O'Shaughnessy because a client had put out an RFP that they wanted a firm who could help them solve some very large problems. And so Ron and Jim and I came together and we said, okay, we'll just do this one project. Well, that one project was about 4 years worth of work. But we found that we liked working together. And so we just kept doing more and more stuff. And so we kept going. Those things were great. And then Ron and Jim decided they wanted to retire independently. So they said, here, take it, keep going your thing, but we're off, we're going to be off and do our own merry thing. Ron wanted to go back and work on transactions, and Jim literally retired. So yeah, that was fascinating. I mean, it turned out to be something important at the time, and I just kept it going.
Are you hiring?
Sure. If I have enough work.
What kind of people are you looking for?
No. So to be fair, I do partner a lot with both lawyers and law firms, and also other individuals. So a lot of it depends on the project, right? So a lot of the work that I'm getting right now is around how to align the portfolio with what the business needs, teaching people how to determine if they're going to be disrupted technologically. How do we explain this to our management? How do we actually utilize and quantify risk, right? So if our portfolio is only defensive, then how do I figure out how much I need to file? How much should we be thinking about and paying for these assets? And then how do I talk to the CFO? A lot of what I'm getting now is how do I talk to the CFO, particularly after a downturn. And in tech, what's happened is with free money, the CFO never asked any questions before, but now in a downturn, they're coming and saying, why are we spending so much money on patents? What are you doing for me? What have you done for me lately? And people are really struggling to respond to that in a way that the CFO understands.
Good. And how do they contact you if they want to either partner with you or get your services?
Yeah, send me an email, connect on LinkedIn, all of those things.
Great. So let's talk about the two books. Now I'm trying to connect the dots here. Pat Sullivan.
Yes, that's my dad.
Ah, okay. Uh, so not only do you work together, job-wise, you write a book together. That's a really special type of relationship. I don't think many dad-daughter pairs ever get that, those multifaceted experiences. So how did that come about?
So the first book in the Edison and the Boardroom I wrote with Julie Davis. And at that time, my company, ICMG, had an exclusive alliance with Arthur Andersen to take this idea of intellectual property management and turn it into a consulting business. So we spent 4 years with Arthur Andersen doing that until actually Arthur Andersen's demise, doing that very thing. And so Julie and I wrote the book, and that was going to be used to help us with our consulting work. Then after that, and it all derived from the gathering, right? So all of these things in the book were things, and the companies in the book are largely gathering companies with stories. We then kept the gathering going, and a second book came out, was going to be looking at other intangibles outside of intellectual property, and that was Einstein in the Boardroom. And Julie had gone off to do her own thing, and so Pat and I decided to write that one together. So we did that book, and then in 2011, 12-ish, really felt that it was time to update the initial Edison book. And so Pat and I, again, we were still working with the gathering. Pat and I decided we would write that one as well. And so we updated it. I will say now I'm getting a lot of requests, both from companies and other people, to update it again. And so, in the process of, I think we'll be doing that next year, but not with Pat.
And are you thinking of a third book, maybe with a woman this time? Somebody in the
So it'll be my
boardroom?
fourth one. So I have 2 Edisons and
That's
one,
right.
be the fourth one. Yeah. So, I don't know. Well, you'll just have to wait and see who it's with.
How about Harrison in the boardroom?
That's right. Ernie goes to the bathroom. No, because we're running out of. That's right. I'll have to be a woman inventor this time.
Yeah. Mentors and mentees. Talk to us. Well, actually, before that, just going back to those 2 books for a moment, since we're talking about leadership, what leadership lessons can you share from those 2 books?
So the first thing I think is that companies want to understand how these things work, right? So when you think about the functions in a company, they're very well defined. And, obviously in business school, you're taught about business and how these different functions operate and what they do, but you're never taught about the legal function, right? That's deemed a legal thing, which you're supposed to learn about in law school. So I think that honestly, business people need to do a better job of understanding what their counsel is telling them. And they need to do a better job of letting counsel advise them of the risks, not make the decision for them. I think what I see today is that, particularly in intellectual property, is that many counsel are focused on risk reduction and actually take the decision away from the business person and don't allow them to manage that risk. Business people manage risk all the time. They manage immense amount of risks with lots and lots of uncertainties. And I think that is bad for both the business and the counsel for them to make that decision. I think they should just explain the risks and let the business person take the decision. I also think that leaders don't always know about what value intellectual property brings them. And in many instances haven't cared, right? So, I think about, like, what kind of job satisfaction are you getting if you're the chief IP counsel and nobody cares? Like, why wouldn't you want to make this strategic or think more strategically about it? Not all businesses require intellectual property management or require it at a very high level, but whatever you do should bring value instead of just collecting widgets, right? So I would hope that people would be curious enough to think through what they're doing. I'll give you an example. So years and years ago, I worked for a private chemical company. And at that time, this thing was a multi-billion-dollar company. There were 2 IP attorneys in the entire company. And so when I went to them and started talking with them because they wanted to implement intellectual property management, they had just, because they were overworked, they had just told everyone in the company only to keep things as a trade secret because that was what was easiest for them. And people didn't even understand that the risk that was happening by virtue of this decision that the attorneys were making because they were overworked. And so I think about that and I'm like, wow, how do you justify that, right? I don't know. So it's interesting.
What happened?
We got people to stop doing that. we got
For you.
them to hire outside counsel. We got them to stop keeping everything as a trade secret and start patenting and to actually begin to quantify those risks so businesses could better figure out what they wanted to do.
Good for you. All right, mentoring and mentorship. So who would you consider to be your mentor?
Judge Paul Michel, David Kapos, Andre Iancu, Ron Laurie, Jim O'Shaughnessy. Those have been, amazing people in my life.
What have they taught you?
Perseverance, to actually state my voice, really use my voice. Because again, partly as a consultant, first off as a consultant and second off as a woman, you're not, well, I'll start with a woman. So as a woman, people don't like when you have opinions in general. That's difficult. Two, as a consultant, where your job is to please people, really, and not get people too irritated at you, you learn to tune down your opinions a little bit so that they're more palatable. I think with all of these people, universally, what they've said is your opinions matter. Just give them your opinions, and we'll back you up. And once you have that level of support, it's 100% game changer. So I would say that, again, going back to Gathering 2, what I learned was you can have opinions and people aren't going to like them, and it's okay. As long as you feel what you're doing is right and you can logically counter it. I think that really and truly that gave me a voice that I didn't have up to that point. So it's been amazing.
And you've never looked back?
Not since then. So yeah, so I think that now I have a lot of opinions and I'm telling a lot of people a lot of opinions, and I've been put in places where I'm allowed to have those opinions, and not everybody likes those opinions. But I think that one of the things that I've learned that I'm very good at is I'm very good at spotting patterns and looking for things that are happening in the future and parsing them through and figuring them out and bringing them to attention. And generally, I'm usually right. And so a lot of this work on IP and national security, came out of an article that we began writing in 2018. The pattern started in 2010, and it took me a while to figure it out. Nobody wanted to believe me for years and years. But hey, look where we are now. It's sort of a hot topic. And a lot of what I do in the gathering and a lot of these things is bringing in new ideas that are not popular. And so most of the time I have arrows in my back. I have people tell me how useless I am, how these things will never pan out, right? So you get poo-pooed a lot. And you just have to believe in yourself enough to keep going if you think it's the right thing to do. And so again, I've just developed a relatively tough skin because I think I'm right. And, I'll go and talk to people about it, and time usually proves it right.
Mentoring. So do you do mentoring of your own?
I do. Yeah. I will happily work with most people, but not surprisingly, a number of women, people are who come to me, and I will always happily work with them. Help them think through problems, help them think through answers, life questions, career advice, how to deal with different managers, all of those sorts of things.
Anyone up and coming we should know about?
There's lots of up and coming that we should know. I think that we have a lot of women IP attorneys who are going to kill it. I think there are amazing women who really and truly can make a difference. And I see this, and actually, I will just say this. I think that dealing with inclusivity is going to change the profession, right? Because if you think your job as an IP attorney is to only sit and take in the applications that, the invention disclosure forms, the IDFs that come across your desk, you're not doing your job. Like, you got to go out and you got to beat the halls and walk the halls, and you need to talk to people. You need to bring all the people who are inventing but don't know it into the fold. And when you think of it that way, it fundamentally changes your job. And there are amazing people doing amazing things, right? Julie Achter from Microsoft. We have John Mulgrew from Lenovo, Jeremiah Chan at Meta. We have Elizabeth Lester at Equifax. I mean, all these people are making and doing amazing things. And, you just don't always hear about it, but it's happening, right? And so
Sounds like I should talk to them and get
yeah,
them
they're
into
all
this
amazing,
season.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's I see it every day. So all these people are changing the world, which I'm super excited to be a part of.
But one thing we didn't talk a whole lot about is your family.
Yeah.
And, as always, social structure, source of support. Tell us about your family.
So my husband, Juan, it comes from the pharmaceutical. He's a chemist by training, but he blew up one too many labs and they committed to business.
Not
So
literally, I hope.
that's right. No, it happened. Yeah. So he has some great stories, but yeah, so we met at a licensing executive society conference years and years ago. And because he was doing licensing, and now he works for a startup immunotherapy data firm, and they're looking for their first a Series B round of funding. So I would say that that's been super interesting, and having someone that I can talk to about all this stuff and vice versa. That's been amazing. So we've been married since 97. We have two kids. My son, who is in his third year of university at University College London, and he's studying neuroscience. And my daughter, who's in her first year at Santa Clara, who's engineering physics. So I have a STEMmy family where I'm the least STEMmy person. And I'm proud of all.
That seems also to be the feature in your career. You're often the only person without a law degree or a science degree, and yet you bring so much,
That's right.
on your own strength.
In the room.
Yeah.
No, it's I think that's, I would say, one of the things I'm interested in. I look for people who have interesting ideas, who are a little different, who think differently. Because I'm curious, what do they see? How do they intuit these things? What is their perspective that is different from everybody else's? And when you find those people, it really does help give a more fulsome view of all the things that are going on. I just find that to be interesting,
Well, how do you talk to your family about that? Because you have such a fascinating career and you do things that are so interesting, but they are also so unconventional. And people that are thinking of modeling their lives after what you've done, what advice do you have for them in talking to family about these career changes?
Yeah, so I think a lot of it is do what you find interesting, right? And I would say that in my career, people thought I was crazy. So they wanted me to pick one thing that I was interested in consulting. It was like, are you interested in valuation or mergers and acquisitions or, litigation consulting, and focus only on that? And I kept saying, no, I want to be a generalist. I want to do it all. I want to do things that interest me. So I think you have to figure out the path that works for you, right? Decide what you're interested in and follow it, right? To the extent you can. And then two, I think it's also just trying to make a difference, whatever that means. In my case, I wanted to write these things down. I wanted to tell a story. I wanted to show that, well, actually, I didn't know what I wanted at the very beginning when we started the gathering, but it turned out into having an opinion about making intellectual property management a management discipline, right? That actually had rules and guidelines, and you could do research on it and had applicability to profitability. And so it has really been a story about how do we tell that story? How do we utilize intellectual property as a business asset more so than a legal asset? And that, now we're relating it to GDP or telling Congress that these things matter, and, just keep trying to figure out new and different ways to use these assets that can be useful for the nation. So I think it's, follow your passion, I guess. But for me, IP was entirely an accidental. I accidentally ended up here. I didn't even know this existed until, partway through my career. So I think we need to create a profession that people know about early on and don't accidentally fall in. We need to be more intentional in people coming into this profession and staying here because they like it.
Right. Last question. So this is my last interview for the year. We are at the cusp of a new year. Tell us what 2024 holds for you. What are you looking forward to? What are you concerned about?
I'm concerned that patents and the USPTO are at an inflection point, that people don't believe this profession is worth going into. They don't believe patents are still a viable alternative for competitive advantage. And that means that the USPTO could become irrelevant. Those are the things I fear. The things I see as good news is that Congress is really, really interested in understanding the relationship between IP and national security. And if this is a new tool for national security, then that becomes important. I think there's more interest in using IP and patents in particular to generate state GDP. And you see a lot of money and interest from NSF and Department of Commerce going into creating new innovation ecosystems within states, which will help, again, bring in new ideas and new inventors and all of those things. I think we're in an election year, so probably not a lot realistically is going to get done. But, the good news is IP is not partisan in the sense that people either believe it provides competitive advantage or believe that it doesn't, but it's not along party lines. And so I hope that we can stop playing political games with IP and actually look at what is the most and highest use of it for the nation. That would be my hope for 2024.
And what about you personally?
I want to keep having fun. I mean, most of what I do, frankly, at this point scares me. So as long as I'm scared, I know that I'm doing the right thing. So I'll probably write another book. I'm going to go and talk to Congress. I'm going to keep pushing on IP and national security and figure out ways that make sense. I'm going to take the diversity pledge. I've spun it out of USIPA, and we're going to go try and get funding for that to make it a full-time endeavor. Again, all things that scare me, but all things that need to be done.
Onward and upward.
Exactly.
Thank you so much, Suzanne.
Thank you, Daryl.